So, welcome everyone to this talk on sectarian politics in Beirut. We're inviting today Dr. Eugene Rogan from Oxford University. He's the director of St. Anthony's College Middle East Center, and he is the author of very well-known books, The Arabs, The History, as well as The Fall of the Ottomans, The Great War in the Middle East. And we now invite Dr. Rogan to take the floor. We hope you will enjoy this talk, which will be followed by a Q&A. Please turn off your microphones during the talk, and if you don't want to appear in the recording, you can also turn off your camera.
Jade, thank you very much, and my thanks to all of you in the Global Development Society for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if remotely, and to get the chance to talk to you about issues of mutual concern in our ever-changing global context. I am delighted to get to talk to you about the sectarian order in Lebanon, not least because I grew up in Beirut and witnessed the workings and weaknesses of that system at first hand. And it's an issue that has really come to the fore in press coverage of Lebanon, not least since the autumn of 2019, when the Lebanese government, faced with a deep economic crisis, took measures to increase taxes on essentials, or at least things that the Lebanese considered essentials, like their gasoline or their tobacco. It began to raise tensions between the Lebanese people and their government, which exploded into demonstrations when the government had the bright idea of trying to impose a tax on people's free telecommunications via WhatsApp. The popular protests that broke out in Beirut in October of 2019 spread rapidly across the other towns and cities of Lebanon. Faced with high unemployment, the figure officially was over 50% at that point, and a stagnant economy, the Lebanese blamed their government and accused them of corruption. Now, that wasn't new. Before the 2019-2020 demonstrations, you already had a series of demonstrations shaking things up in Lebanon. There was the You Stink popular protest movement in 2015, which focused on the government's failure to manage waste collection and waste recycling. They were basically poisoning the beaches and the fragile environment of Mount Lebanon with uncollected garbage. The subsequent political campaign to seize control of municipal elections in Lebanon gave rise to the Beirut Madinati movement in 2016, and that demonstrated the popular power of the Lebanese people when they lost the election, but they still managed to win 40% of the vote, which was unprecedented to have political actors from outside the sectarian order who were able to mobilize people in a successful election campaign, such as Beirut Madinati, or Beirut is my city, in 2016. Popular protests against misgovernment and corruption, my point is, were not new by the time they broke out in 2019. What set the demonstrations of 2019-2020 apart was a challenge the demonstrators posed to Lebanon's sectarian system of government. The demonstrators crossed sectarian divide, Muslim, Christians, and Druze linking arms in a call to sweep away all of their politicians without exception. Their slogan was Kulhum Yani Kulhum, which means all of them means all of them. In other words, get rid of everyone in the political class. They rallied as Lebanese citizens, not as members of religious communities. And their demands threatened a power-sharing arrangement that had shaped Lebanese politics for a century and more. Sectarianism, as a political order, is a power-sharing arrangement designed to give different religious communities a stake in the political order through a form of proportional representation. So, in abstract terms, there's a logic to the system that might work. It was first introduced to Lebanon by the Ottomans in the 1840s, when Mount Lebanon was divided into a northern region under a Maronite Christian governor and a southern region under a Druze governor. When that system collapsed in communal fighting that led to massacres in the summer of 1860, The Ottomans, pressured by the European powers, imposed a new system of government on Mount Lebanon. The governor would be a non-Lebanese Ottoman Christian who would rule through a 12-member governing council whose members were drawn proportionately from the different religious communities of Mount Lebanon. Now, the system held for over 50 years until the First World War ushered in a post-Ottoman world. France had secured her allies' approval to integrate Lebanon into its empire after the First World War. And unusually in this case, France actually had support from the indigenous population, or at least a share of the indigenous population. The Maronite Christians saw France as a protector and an ally and hoped to secure an independent Christian state as part of the partition of Ottoman Arab lands. Now, France delivered half of that package. They enlarged the territory of Mount Lebanon to include the coastal plains from the Shiite-dominated southern towns of Sidon and Tyre, up as far north as the Sunni Muslim-dominated city of Tripoli, and established territories running eastward through the fertile Bekaa Valley, right up to the western slopes of the anti-Lebanon Mountains. It was the largest landmass the French could gift their Maronite clients while still preserving a Christian majority, and only just a Christian majority. So that was the half that the French delivered, a Christian state. However, the package that France kept was the independence part. Grand Liban, or Greater Lebanon, was to be a French colony in all but name, right up until the 1940s. As the Lebanese came to realize that France did not intend to confer their independence, they began to mobilize to reconsider their options. One intellectual, writing in the French language newspaper Le Réveil, argued for a vision of citizenship rather than sectarian divisions. He wrote, "Do we wish to become a nation in the real and whole sense of the word, or to conserve ourselves as a laughable mix of communities, always separate from each other, like hostile tribes? We must furnish ourselves a unique unifying symbol, a nationality. That flower can never thrive in the shadow of steeples or of minarets, but only under a flag." But this vision of Lebanese citizens united behind a flag remained elusive. It served French colonial authorities to promote sectarianism as a classic divide and rule scheme in which French interests would be upheld through their Christian clients. Of course, Lebanese Christians would prove no less nationalist than their Muslim and Druze compatriots. But sectarianism served Christian, particularly Maronite interests, as a means to preserve their hegemony over Lebanon. This became increasingly important as the Christian majority of 58% in 1920 was reduced through differential birth rates to only just 50% by the 1932 census. So by 1932, a Christian majority of 58% had been reduced to just over 50%. At that point, the Lebanese government stopped counting. There has not been a national census taken in Lebanon since 1932, because everyone knew that the numbers would reveal that Lebanon was not, in fact, a Christian majority country. According to my good friend Wikipedia, the current balance of populations in Lebanon as of 2010 was 45% Christian, 48% Muslim, and just over 5% Druze. That was in 2010, out of total population of 4.3 million. But all of these figures are derived by estimates made by various interested parties. Those numbers actually came from an organization set up in Lebanon through the US State Department's agency. Take of that what you will. Anyway, as Lebanon pressed for independence in the 1940s, its political leaders came together to try and strike a compromise to preserve national unity through a rigid sectarian division of power. The 1943 National Pact was never committed to paper. It proved no less influential for the economy shown to paper and ink. The pact stipulated that the President of the Republic would forevermore be a Maronite Christian. The Prime Minister would be a Sunni Muslim, the Speaker of Parliament a Shiite Muslim, and so on through the key offices in the cabinet. In Parliament, for every 6 Christian parliamentary members, there would be 5 Muslims. And in this case, Sunni, Shi'i, and Druze were all lumped together as a sort of Muslim bloc. This became the sectarian distribution of power that Lebanon carried into independence in 1945 as one of the few democratic states in the Middle East. But I use the word democratic with a little bit of irony because it had, as it were, a very rigid distribution of power that was at its heart anti-democratic in principle. Now, the contradictions of Lebanon's sectarian democracy were exacerbated after the 1948 war and the sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of mostly Sunni Muslim Palestinian refugees fleeing the creation of the State of Israel and the Arab world's defeat in the First Arab-Israeli War. If you ask why the Lebanese didn't do more to integrate the Palestinians into their society or give them citizenship, it is because the Palestinians so upturned the sectarian balance in Lebanon. It's why Palestinians are confined to refugee camps in Lebanon down to today and banned from entering dozens of professions by law. The Lebanese are absolutely determined to keep the Palestinians from integrating into the body politic of Lebanon because they knew that it would spell the end of the sectarian order enshrined by the 1943 National Pact. Now, of course, the Palestinian presence in Lebanon was a reality that destabilized the body politic in Lebanon. One of the most outspoken advocates of Palestinian rights in Lebanon was the Druze leader Kamal Jumblat, who launched the national movement in the early 1970s, seeking to replace the sectarian order with a secular order of one citizen, one vote. To his critics, Jumblat's call for a secular Lebanon was a simple bid for Muslim majority rule. By the mid-1970s, Lebanese Muslims are estimated to outnumber the Christians by a ratio of 55 to 45. Sectarianism was no longer proportional representation, and there was no mechanism to redistribute power short of civil war. Now, I was actually living in Lebanon in April of 1975. I was in high school at the time. And it was a time of heightened social tensions. Major social demonstrations were taking place. Fishermen in Sidon, unions in Beirut. And the Palestinian issue was really at the height of its ferment, shaping a political order that was increasingly leftward oriented, in which the Maronite Christians were part of the kind of conservative right-wing elements trying to preserve the status quo. At that moment of heightened social protest and tension, in April of 75, a carload of gunmen fired at the Maronite leader, Pierre Gemayel, head of the influential Phalangist or Kataib party, as he was leaving church. They didn't get Gemayel himself, but they killed 3 people, including one of his bodyguards. Gemayel headed a militia of 15,000 men, and they were outraged at this attack on their leader. They immediately sought revenge and ambushed a busload full of Palestinians driving through a Christian neighborhood called Ain Rumane. They killed all 28 Palestinians on board. And that was the spark that set off 15 years of civil war in Lebanon. It was to prove a conflict that pitted each of the different religious and political communities of Lebanon against each other in an ever-changing kaleidoscope that would take far more time than the brief talk we have today would allow for. Suffice it to say, when the warring parties finally sat down to negotiate an end to the Lebanese civil war in Taif, Saudi Arabia in 1990, it was not to replace sectarianism as a system of government, so much as to tinker with the balance of power. The president would still be a Maronite, but would have its executive powers reduced. The powers the president shed went to an enhanced prime ministry, but the prime minister would still be a Sunni Muslim. The Speaker of Parliament would still be a Shiite, and there would still be a distribution of the other cabinet posts among the religious communities of Lebanon. And in Parliament, rather than change the idea of a confessional distribution, they just brought parity so that for every 5 Christians, you would have 5 Muslims, where again, Sunni, Shi'i, and Druze all counted as Muslims. So as you can see, this is not a root and branch reform. This is a simple tinkering with the system as established in the 1943 National Pact and trying to deal with one of the fundamental flaws of Lebanese sectarianism, which as a system of proportional representation with no census to show how the community's balance was changing, you had to simply get people to negotiate new numbers without there being any clear rationale for how people would share power in the system. For the past 30 years, since 1991, this sectarian structure has come to increasing strain. And the history of Lebanon has still been one very much torn by conflict, even since the Taif Accords. You had, of course, the Syrian occupation. You've had Israeli invasion and many subsequent Israeli incursions, even after the withdrawal in 2000. You have the disproportionate power of the Shiite militia and party Hezbollah, playing the real role of kingmaker in Lebanese politics. And the political order has proven less and less capable of providing for the needs of the citizens of Lebanon. Instead, you have scions of political families inheriting their seats in parliament, sure of the votes from the members of their religious community. But instead of providing for their constituents, the politicians abuse their political office to line their own pockets and to enrich a narrow group of their cronies. In 2011, the Lebanese watched as Arab Spring uprisings unfolded across the Middle East without getting involved themselves. At the time, some of us said it was the experience of civil war that made the Lebanese cautious. They knew what the price could be if you were to rise up against order, and that in disorder could come war. Others said that Lebanon's political system was still a democracy, and it didn't produce the kind of deeply entrenched autocrats like Libya's Gaddafi or Tunisia's Ben Ali or Egypt's Mubarak. Dictators who had ruled their country for a quarter century or more and broken the social contract. But the deeply entrenched political elite of Lebanon behaved no less autocratically than the Mubaraks of Egypt or the Ben Alis of Tunisia. And it was the system itself that proved the autocratic clique. And by 2019, it was Lebanon's turn to revolt against the system, not against one autocratic ruler, but against them all. Kulhum yani kulhum. All of them means all of them. Yet this is not a simple Arab Spring uprising against a single dictator. As I've tried to show in the course of this talk, the roots of sectarianism in Lebanon run very deeply. Each of the religio-political communities in Mount Lebanon's system represents an entrenched interest group determined to preserve their interests. Many would be willing to take up arms in defense of their community's interests against their fellow citizens. The biggest threat clearly is Hezbollah, more powerful than the Lebanese army, more loyal to its leadership, and basically better supported by an outside power, in this case Iran, than any other community in Lebanon. Moreover, like the Arab Spring uprisings, the movement in Lebanon has no real leadership. It's not putting forward a new team of political leaders to replace the old. Without a credible alternative that would enjoy the support of Lebanese of all communities, inertia will prove very strong. And finally, this is a very hard time to try and impose root and branch change on the political order of a country now a century old. The country has been reduced to absolute penury. The government basically has no money. That's why we saw the attempt to try and introduce new taxes back in 2015. Moreover, the economic shocks that Lebanon has suffered has reduced the value of the currency to about a fraction, some say a fifth of its value. So the purchasing power of people's salaries has been reduced to absolutely nothing. COVID is ravaging Lebanon at this point, and illnesses are taking its health system to the brink of collapse. People are beginning to go hungry. I'm not talking about poor people beginning to go hungry. They've been going hungry for a long time. I'm talking middle-class professionals, kind of doctors and lawyers. They're beginning to go hungry. The very people who would be the backbone of a political movement of change are facing a kind of existential crisis right now. And then add to that the destruction inflicted on Beirut by last August's port explosion of that hoard of ammonium nitrate. It was the largest non-nuclear explosion in human history. It killed over 200, it wounded over 7,500, it inflicted over $15 billion US dollars of damage to the urban fabric of Beirut. It's hard to think of a time less apt for trying to bring about change to a deeply entrenched political order. Well, it was never going to be easy to overturn Lebanon's sectarian order. And in 2021, it's looking harder than ever. But let me pause here and take your questions.
Yes, sir. Out of curiosity, been kind of wondering about this. There's been a kind of immigration, if you would, over time of the whole Lebanese parties. For example, you know, the SSNP, haven't they kind of shifted power over to Syria, so they actually don't really need Lebanon anymore for support? They just kind of need it to kind of keep their streets. Isn't that the kind of same situation for most parties now? They don't actually need the people, they just kind of need their location.
Are you speaking of Syria or of the Lebanese government itself?
Oh, no, SSNP.
The SSNP. Yeah, I mean, the SSNP would be one of those party / militias whose place in the political order is being contested now by this popular movement, but whose deep entrenched position makes them particularly difficult to displace. So why did you pick on the SSNP, Michael? What was it about that movement in particular that made you think of them?
Mainly because, you know, they've always been kind of persecuted. They actually don't, they've kind of been collapsed 3 times in the last century and rebuilt themselves from dozens of different groups. Not exactly, well, they're sectarian. They're kind of have a bit bigger branch than others. And they can just kind of rebuild themselves from the spore again and again.
The question is, what is the big new idea they would have to offer to inspire Lebanese to place their trust in the movement in 2021? I mean, I think what Lebanese protesters are really angling for is a kind of new vision that will allow Lebanon, the merchant republic, to be able to engage in the global economy in a way which allows them to play to their strengths. And their strengths have always been in trade and finance. It's always been in human capital. It's always been in education. They would like to see themselves really take a position at the forefront of high tech, artificial intelligence. But, you know, the country is not stable or secure enough to attract the kind of investments or the kind of companies that would allow the job creation. And so, you know, they're looking for stability. They're looking for a government that would be able to encourage the kind of investments in their economy that would allow them to reach takeoff. And it's something which they all have ideas of what they'd like to see, but putting in motion the virtuous cycle that's going to enable it to happen, that seems to be the elusive part of the formula.
So thank you very much, Dr. Rogan, for giving us that overview of the history of sectarianism in Lebanon. We have a lot of people on the call at the moment, so if people have questions, could they please either use the hand raising emote or put the question in chat? And that's not, you know, we hadn't made that clear, so sorry about that, Michael. But yeah, just to keep some order on everything.
Yeah, good question to start with. Liam, do you want to manage the questions for me and recognize the hands as they come up?
Sure, yeah, I'll do that then.
So bring it on, guys. Let's hear your questions.
So we have a question from Maeve in the chat. Thank you so much for this talk, Professor Rogan. I would like to hear your thoughts on whether you see the formation of a technocratic government based on the consensus of civil society organizations. And sorry, long chat I'm scrolling through.
I know, it's hard.
And political technocrats, something similar to the government formed after the process facilitated by the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet in Tunisia as the political solution to Lebanon's current political crisis. And would it be possible in Lebanon in the way it was in Tunisia? And that question is in the chat if you want a non-broken up version.
Excellent. Well, Maeve, thank you for that. And it's interesting to be comparing Tunisia and Lebanon, not least because traditionally those are the two kind of electoral systems, or the West-leaning democracies in the 20th century. But you know, if you talk to the demonstrators in Lebanon, or when I talk to my friends in Lebanon who are taking part in the demonstrations, you know, that vision of technocrats who represent the well-educated Lebanese who are in it for all Lebanese and not just for people of their own religious community. That vision of a kind of secular citizenship is I think, exactly what they aspire to. And so we know what it is you'd like to see. You'd like to see people who are experts in the different areas of government. You can devolve responsibility to people who know what they're doing, who would be in office not because of the cronyism of the system, but because of their merits as trained professionals, and who would be, you know, dedicated to delivering for all Lebanese, not trying to favor members of specific communities because that's who ultimately they owe their position to. But, you know, it's getting there that's the hard thing. So the challenge I see is very similar to, I mean, it's actually similar to Tunisia. I was going to say to Egypt, where you had people come together in Tahrir Square. They knew they wanted to end autocratic government. They had an idea of what kind of people they would like representing the Egyptian people, but there wasn't, if you like, an organized group who could put themselves forward and compete in elections to try and earn the mandate, earn the legitimacy, earn the trust that comes with standing for election. And I think, you know, for all the demonstrations that you've had in Lebanon, you haven't seen the emergence of groups who put forward a platform. Now, I hear of groups being formed now. I hear of groups in the Lebanese diaspora. The Lebanese overseas have been very successful. Many are very wealthy. They're very patriotic. They would like to leverage their networks, connections, and wealth to try and help Lebanon through this crisis and, you know, create a kind of new vision for politics in their country. But, you know, it's easier said than done. And it's going to have to come back to Lebanon. Expats won't be able to parachute in a vision. They're going to need to work with local people, put together new movements. Those movements will have to get politically engaged. That requires party organization. And, you know, where does the luxury of all that come from in a Lebanon that is in such a broken state right now? It's almost as though you need to have a caretaker government that will try and keep things running and then create a national dialogue, rather like what's going on in Libya right now, where coming out of a real conflict between rival governments, you have now a UN brokered process to try and put in place a caretaker government, and then to try and hold elections, and then try and build a consensus around a new leadership. But boy, tough to do. And Tunisia tells you how tough it is. Look at how Tunisia has struggled to rewrite its political order with a new constitution, gain consensus from the voting public in Tunisia to base its political order around that. And still this new government, which is more legitimate than any in Tunisia's independent history, that has accepted the transfer of power from, you know, one elected president to the next, or from one parliament to the next. but still is incapable of attracting the investment to create the jobs to provide for the welfare of the Tunisian people. And Tunisia is racked with public demonstrations right now against the failure of government to provide for its economy and its people's needs. So Tunisia is a great example of what can be achieved in terms of rewriting the social contract, and yet what the difficulties are in front of reformist Arab states trying to put in place technocratic governments. It's a very, very hard road ahead. And these are countries with very well-educated middle classes, with great human capital, with all the resources to be able to connect to at least the Mediterranean world of Europe and the Middle East and Africa, to engender, you know, the kind of benefits that will create jobs and create prosperity. But it just seems so elusive now. Liam, what do you have for me?
Yeah, thank you very much for that response, Professor Rogan.
More of a torrent than a response, but it was a big, long question, Maeve. So I hope I managed to touch on bits of what you were looking for.
Yeah, you did. Thanks so much.
Okay, so next we have a question from Dara. Do you see any specific failings in Beirut, Madinati, apologies, and subsequently Kulana Watani as movements, or did they simply come up against a regime which would not allow them to genuinely participate in the political system? Also, do you understand the protests which took place in Tripoli in the last few weeks? How do you understand, rather, the protests that took place in Tripoli in the last few weeks? Do you view them as an extension or continuation of the October 19 movement?
Thank you, Dara. Great questions. And it's clear you guys are following what's going on in the region with really keen eyes. These are very smart questions. So my take on bothUstink and Beirut Madinati is these are really successful movements at mobilizing people, at engaging young people in politics in a way that they had not been before. There was almost a sense that politics was an old person's and actually an old man's game. But with these popular protest movements, and then morphing into an actual political campaign, I mean, I think Beirut Madinati's activists were absolutely amazed by the way they were able to raise funds, contest elections, and do as well as they did. You know, there was something very quixotic about what they launched. They did it really in spite of, rather than in hopes of, the political order. And if you like, it's probably what's encouraging political action today to think, you know, if we continue this trend of mobilization, if we take the 60% of our population that's under the age of 30 and give them a sense that the future belongs to them only if they get politically engaged. And if they get politically engaged, no one can take the political future away from them. And to allow them to begin to think about trying to set an agenda. So I think after the strength of, and Beirut Madinati was really only focusing on the municipal level. The challenge now is at the national level. And as I said in my brief presentation, you can mobilize the under 30s. They are a potent force to be reckoned with. They're well-educated, they're ambitious. They've been around the world and they know how it works, and they can see what's not working in their own societies. So they have the means to actually put forward an agenda for change, but they have to do it now. You know, as they were successful in mobilizing people to campaign for municipal, less complex, lower level of government than parliamentary and cabinet government. Now they're going to have to step up to the challenge of trying to take on the entrenched zu'ama, or leaders, political leadership of Lebanon, and try and beat them at their own game. And those guys, you know, they're wily old foxes, and they haven't held on to power for so long because they're fools. They've come to take their position for granted. They have certainly taken their constituents for granted. And in that, I think probably they will face a challenge and they will face change. But it's going to take something very organized, very smart, and very appealing to a broad base of Lebanese. And And in that, there is a very serious challenge to be faced. You know, I see what's going on in Tripoli as very much a challenge to the failings of the central government privileging Beirut over the peripheries in Lebanon. This has been not a new movement for Tripoli. It's an old and recurring movement. I mean, Tripoli is one city that really sat uncomfortably within the greater Lebanon as France drew the map back in 1920. They would have much more naturally been part of a country of Syria, of a sort of Sunni majority place. The port's links to inland cities in Syria was always critical to its vitality, and it has always suffered as a second city under Beirut as the belly of Lebanon, consuming absolutely all the country's resources. So, you know, what you're seeing in Tripoli is very much a response to that, and is a revitalizing of a localized challenge against the failings of the political system as it plays out in one urban concentration in Tripoli.
Perfect. Thank you much. Thank you very much, Professor Rogan. We are going to go to a question from Anya Healy next, and then back to Michael, who's had his hand emoted up for a while. And so, question from Anya. Thank you so much, Professor Rogan. Do you think Hezbollah is gaining political leverage among Lebanese society as both a military force and a social care provider, healthcare and de facto hospitals during the pandemic? And are they strengthening politically as a party during such conditions?
You know, it's a really good question. And I don't have enough of a handle on where Hezbollah sits on the shifting plates of Lebanese politics right now. All the things you pointed to in your question are the traditional bases of strength and support for Hezbollah. And Hezbollah plays sectarian politics better than any other community at this point. You highlighted the way in which they had been there in providing healthcare support. They're the ones that organize the kind of financial resources to help in the reconstruction of villages damaged after Israeli conflicts or whatnot. They have created a kind of network for redistribution among the needy. They've always played to the fact that the Shiites of Lebanon had been the most disadvantaged in Lebanese sectarian political economy. And they work very much with the support of Iran to help them to provide financial resources, but also to provide the kind of military hardware that's enabled Hezbollah's military wing to remain the only militia in the post-Taif Lebanese spectrum. The Taif Accords, which brought the end to the Lebanese civil war of 1975 to 1990, stipulated that all militias had to dissolve as part of the resolution of the war. Hezbollah is the only one that was able to hold out against that, down to the present day, justified in terms of being the resistance to the Israelis in South Lebanon. At the time of Taif, of course, South Lebanon was under Israeli occupation and would stay so for another decade after that. So this has justified something which is now long out of date. I mean, the Israelis left in 2000. Here we are, 2021. You know, what is Hezbollah doing as a militia and a party, and super strong as both? Well, the militia gives them a margin of power and appeal because in the Middle East, alas, it is men with guns who have really been able to demonstrate political power. If you have military muscle to back up your political position, you are better placed to deliver on your political platform. And that's Hezbollah's position. Now, we know that there have been Shiite advocates of change gathering in the demonstrations in 2019, 2020 in downtown Beirut. And all the journalists like to take pictures of Shiites linking arms with Maronites and calling for all of their political leaders to go. Kulhum yani kulhum. So there clearly are challenges being posted to the kind of kingmaker position that Hezbollah is playing in Lebanon today. And if you're going to challenge the sectarian order as what is corrupt and what is failing in Lebanon's politics today, you are going to have to take on Hezbollah. But the chances of taking on Hezbollah are about as slender as, let us say, popular protests in Tahrir displacing the Egyptian army as the force behind the presidency in Lebanon since 1952, or the dominant force in the political economy of Egypt today. These are deeply entrenched realities. And it's going to take more than popular protest movements or civilian protest movements to displace such powerful and entrenched interests as Hezbollah. And I think that Iran would back Hezbollah to the bitter end because it's so central to Iran's position as kingmaker in the Middle East as a whole. You know, its ties to Shia militias in Iraq, its ties upholding the Syrian government, and its ties to Hezbollah. You know, this is central to making a Middle East that Iran is comfortable in, and they're not going to let Hezbollah fall easily.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Professor Rogan. Michael, if you want to hop in with your question now. Okay, I will read it out. Would you say the goal is very risky given Lebanon is so close to the UAE and other monarchies who would oppose it because of their fear of democracy? Case in point, the attempt at revolution in Bahrain was crushed by the Saudis and their Western allies. Given Syria was invited by a government that was falling, would history not repeat itself with the cliques and their backers?
Really good question. I mean, I think that the situation in Bahrain and in Lebanon shares a kind of sectarian conflict. It was the one distinction in Bahrain that separated it from all of the other Arab Spring uprisings. But, you know, I'm not really sure that it's a question of whether other Arab states would intervene in Lebanon. You know, the days where Lebanon was seen as being a central chessboard for regional disputes to play out are gone. You know, the powers that backed Lebanese militias during the civil war were Syria, Iraq. You know, you had some support from Sunni states in the Gulf, but nothing to match what Iran was doing for backing first the Amal movement and then Hezbollah when it emerged in the 1980s. You know, none of those countries really sees what happens in Lebanon as being particularly important or influential for their interests. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, they're really far more engaged in trying to contain what they see as Iran's position. And for them, the battleground is far more to do with Syria. We saw that with the way they supported different militias in the Syrian civil war and the positions they took around ISIS versus the various Al-Qaeda affiliates in the Syrian conflict. I mean, I think that perhaps Israel has been more interventionist in Lebanon because of their own very tense relations with Iran. They see Hezbollah as sort of Iran's cat's paw on their frontier, and they've shown a willingness to intervene in Lebanon. So if I were to point to countries that more immediately might interfere in Lebanese politics, it would be Iran, Israel. I don't even think Syria will be in a position to do much just because the Assad regime is so beleaguered in trying to establish its control over all of its territories after nearly a decade of civil war there. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would look to other Arab states to intervene, but Iran, Israel, I'd watch out for those two.
Perfect, thank you very much. So we have time for 2 more questions, and we have 1 question on the list. So Jade, are you going to want to?
I think we just missed out on one question that was just above, related to Hezbollah, so the previous one, saying, what are your thoughts on the killing of Lokman Slim, and what do you think the repercussions will be politically and socially?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the assassination of Lokman Slim was a real shockwave. I mean, not that he had not anticipated the possibility of his being assassinated, but the way he was killed, you know, in a village in the south, suggests that his politics resisting Hezbollah were very much at play, and it will tell you that, you know, the risk to those who would try and threaten the entrenched interests of sectarian politics in Lebanon are real. And as I said, that people might take arms to defend their entrenched interests is real. And so it's going to take a great deal of courage to try and challenge the status quo. And I think people feel strength in numbers. Luqman Salim was in a rented car and had driven south on his own. I think when people gather around the Burj in downtown Beirut in their tens and hundreds of thousands, there is a sense of strength in numbers. And, so what an acephalous, a headless movement means is that there aren't Luqman Salim type targets to assassinate. It may discourage people from raising their heads above the parapet to present themselves as candidates of a new order for Lebanon, for fear that they might be the next who might be assassinated as part of preserving a system which, though failing, still preserves the interests of the beneficiaries of that system.
So if anyone else has any questions, we have another 5 minutes or so. You can put them in the chat. A question from Jade. Yeah, if you want to
go. I have one question about Western influence in Lebanon, because during the explosion, I remember I saw on French television, they were interviewing Lebanese people who were really desperate for help, and many people were calling on a return to the French mandate, which I found very disturbing. So I was wondering what you thought about Western influence in the region, also because President Macron was very engaged when that happened. He went there and there were concerts in France as well that were organized in support of Lebanon. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I understand the reasons why you were disturbed to hear a call for a return to colonialism. But I think the call was not one of people who wanted to surrender their independence so much as their belief that it would take a foreign intervention to prise the interest groups out of power and to enable a transition to a different form of government. And there is a sense that the imperial powers have historical responsibility for what they left the Middle East didn't work. It crops up every time Israel-Palestine comes to a major anniversary. The Palestinians are very keen to remind the British of the role they played in setting in motion partnership with Zionism that would lead to the emergence of the state of Israel at the expense of the state of Palestine. And the Palestinians want to remind the British that they bear historic responsibility for the turn of events that has left now millions of Palestinians stateless and living in diaspora and refugee communities, and they leave the responsibility of that on Britain's doorstep. When it comes to the sectarian order in Lebanon, as I tried to point out in my brief remarks, there really is a French mandate legacy here. And it served the British well to reward a client community, the Christians generally, the Maronites specifically, by creating a Christian state. What we know now, and the French didn't know then, was their empire only had a couple of decades left to run. The French were hoping they would have an empire that would last a century or more after Lebanon's absorption. And so finding clients who would uphold imperial interests for the benefit of the French was precisely what lay behind creating a sectarian order. And then you try and come up with a power sharing system so that the other communities in Lebanon would still have a stake in the order and not try and subvert it by nationalist movements or by armed conflict. Well, that order has proved no longer able to deliver for the needs of the Lebanese people, if ever it did. And so when they say, now we want to go back to France coming in and helping to sort the mess out, I mean, it's almost as if they're saying they need to have a new UN mandate with France coming and taking responsibility for messing up Lebanese politics with this failed sectarianism. and helping to be the muscle that would allow a new order to take its place without armed militias or entrenched warlords fighting the move towards a new Lebanon, better designed under technocratic government to provide for the needs of its people. But yeah, I mean, I think there's very little stomach in Lebanon today, least of all among the Sunni and Shi'i pluralities, to have Europeans come in and tell them how to run their affairs. And anyone looking at the Gilets jaunes experience in Paris in the past 2019, 2020 period would say that maybe the French are not the people to bring order. Rather, the people seem to be very good at bringing disorder in France. You can learn a lot from Gilets jaunes on how to organize protest movements, but maybe Macron has not been so good at demonstrating the ability of reestablishing order.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jade.
So Jade actually took what I was going to ask as well. So we have one more question in the chat from Dara. Do you see any similarities between Hezbollah and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, particularly in relation to their role in thwarting the emergence of a broad-based popular movement in both countries?
Well, the difference between the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Hezbollah in Lebanon is, the Muslim Brotherhood really could say that they did represent a popular base, that Egypt's 90+% Sunni Muslim population had tremendous support for the Muslim Brotherhood as an opposition movement, Muslim in its articulation, that had the courage of its convictions to stand up against autocratic rulers. And when the Arab Spring Revolution came to Egypt in 2011, they were able to harness that energy, claim it as their own. It was not a Muslim Brotherhood movement, obviously, but they claimed it, and use it as a vehicle for them to finally come to political power, something that had eluded the Muslim Brotherhood all along. At that point, they began to lose their broad support base, but they could claim to be speaking on behalf of an Islamic political movement that represented a majority of people in Egypt. Hezbollah represents a plurality. I mean, there's a big debate. We've already said it's impossible to know numbers of communities in Lebanon. They stopped counting in 1932. But there is a debate on whether the largest community in Lebanon today is actually the Sunni Muslims or the Shia Muslims. But it's one of those communities that's got a plurality, and it's a significant plurality. But it's not more than that. And Hezbollah, it can claim to represent all Lebanese. It's the resistance to Israel. Patriotic Lebanese of many different communities thought that Hezbollah was great in the way they stood up to Israel. In 2006, everyone was praising Hezbollah, whether they were Orthodox Christians or Sunni Muslims or Shiite Muslims. But, when it comes down to the political distribution of power, the Hezbollah could never claim to speak on all Lebanese, on behalf of all Lebanese, in the same way the Muslim Brotherhood could. So, and you saw the limits of what the Muslim Brotherhood could do. I think that for Hezbollah, the limits are even more obvious, because the big difference is, by being both a militia and a political party, there is this threat to the Lebanese order that Hezbollah poses that the Muslim Brotherhood never could. And so, they represent, if you like, a combination of army and political party, and then the outside power of Iran, which is both their strength and perhaps what makes them unappealing to the rest of the Lebanese.
Brilliant. We have 2 minutes left, so I will very quickly read the final question that came in. What do you think about the potential of future Syrian Hezbollah, the massive amount of Shia fighters and their families granted land, citizenship, and brought their families with them as a reward by the IRG and Shia preachers coming in, is one of the greatest demographic shifts in the Middle East in some time? Does this not make Iran's relationship with Lebanon less vital, given that they have a much bigger prize on the table?
Really good question. And before I go, I do want to compliment you all. I have been absolutely blown away by the sophistication of your questions. And it's just great to see how you're engaging with the issues in the region. And I take it it's not just Lebanon, that if we were to talk more broadly across the Middle East, you probably are going to be just as smart on that too. So for any of you thinking about applying for master's programs in Middle Eastern studies, we've got this really nice program here at Oxford, and I'd like to see some applications from you guys when you're done with your studies in Dublin. That was shameless poaching on my part. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question about the relocation of Lebanese Shia in Syria as a kind of reward for their role in propping up the Assad regime. There's a lot going on in Syria that's very pernicious. I mean, to state the obvious, there's a civil war going on, and there's a butcherous regime that has committed, mass atrocity against its own people. I won't go on. But among the things that makes it really hard to imagine at the end of this civil war that there will be a return to a Syria that's safe for the Syrians to return to, the laws that are being passed by the regime that are barring the return of Syrians who have left. There's been a depopulation of Syria by refugees fleeing the country or displaced internally. And the regime is making it quite clear that those who've left really aren't welcome back. And they would feel more comfortable, having Lebanese Shiite allies settle in Syria as supporters of the regime than try and create a climate of post-war reconciliation in which the Syrian people might return to their own lands. All I would say is it's a very dangerous thing to do, because people do not surrender their homes and their land lightly. Without giving you another history lecture, a lot of the problems that underlay the divisions between Druze and Maronites in Lebanon in the 19th century had to do with the Druze, having been displaced, saw their lands taken over by Maronite Christians who refused to hand it back to them. And the Druze came back with a fight, and that led to massacres in 1860. I can imagine Shiites taking lands or properties in Syria, facing retribution by Syrians determined to come back to their own country at some future date, being the source of a future conflict. I don't think it's a basis for stability in Syria in the future. And I actually think it's going to be a danger for the Shiite power in Lebanon itself. You wouldn't want too many of your fighting age young men and their young families settling in Syria instead of being in Lebanon to be the bedrock of Hezbollah's power in Lebanon. You wouldn't want to dilute that too much. But clearly there's something going on right now which represents a really important demographic shift. And it's going to have political ramifications, and it's going to shape politics in Syria and in Lebanon for years to come. I'll keep my eyes on that.
Okay, so I'd just like to say on behalf of Global Dev and everyone here, thank you very much, Professor Rogan. That was a really, really genuinely excellent talk. I'm really blown away by your storytelling ability and the fact that you can hold so many multi-part questions in your head that I struggle to even read out directly. So really, genuinely thank you for that talk.
Liam, you're too generous, but thank you. It's really been a pleasure to be with you guys. And I just wish we had more time, and I wish it was more face-to-face. But I am serious. Anybody interested in doing more in the Middle East, my email address is online. Do drop me a line, and I'd be glad to talk about where you're going from here.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of us would be very grateful to be poached by that master's program. So you probably get a few
good
there. So thank you very much to everyone for coming along. I hope our future events are this well attended. And this was really just a fantastic talk all around. So thank you all. Thank you for Professor Rogan.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.